I'm fascinated. I mean, we've talked so much about longevity and have not yet spoken about with investors who are particularly focused on longevity as an investment thesis. So I'd love to talk to all of you about what that looks like and how to approach it, and whether there's a business in just investing in longevity. So Laura, do you mind starting out? Because that is your focus.
Yeah, sure. So I guess a bit of quick background. I've been working in the longevity space since I was 12 years old, working in the lab on C. elegans worms, which are really super fun, cool, translucent sort of little organisms. And then when I was 14, I went to MIT to do some work with Lenny Guarente there on aging mice. And then 2 years after that, dropped out of college and started a venture capital fund in Silicon Valley, mostly focused on investing in drugs that we believe will impact aging. And so, you know, I think one of the interesting things for me has been 5 years ago, when this was like the thing that I was most passionate about, like nobody thought it was cool. Like now aging is really sexy, right? Like if you have an aging company, everybody wants to invest in it because it sounds really cool. But 5 years ago, aging was like the worst possible word you could have in your pitch deck, and it made everybody very unexcited to talk to you.
And what changed, do you think?
Well, Calico, I think. I mean, it's just a very obvious thing. I think, you know, like the earlier panel was saying, you know, you have Art Levinson and Google coming together. Everyone's like, okay, well, we're lemmings, we'll do that too. But I think the fascinating thing has just been the huge uptick in interest in the past 2 to 3 years in this space, which really we hadn't seen before. And also I think how that mirrors how the science itself has evolved to the point where it's possible to invest. So you have to understand in aging science, the first ever experiment to show any kind of really reproducible aging results was in 1983. And the next one after that was in 1993. And I think at that point, the aging science field really took off. So it's been about 20 years of work in this field. Compare that to cancer, where you see kind of the work stretch back to even the 1920s, I think. And there's been a lot more kind of area under the curve of focus on that disease versus aging, which I would kind of view as a much more fundamental and important disease. So I think that's just a little bit of context. The fact that, you know, the field of aging is as old as maybe like the kids of some people in this room. And that's a really interesting fact that I think not many people appreciate about the science.
Yeah, you've heard it first here, aging is sexy, right? Is that that's the takeaway?
No, I think that's it's a 2-year-old trend now. So
okay, all right.
Now you're late to the party.
Esther, you're investing both from in terms of a non-profit and then also for-profit ventures. Can you talk a little bit about your approach?
Is this, yes?
Yes, it's on.
So I'm going to have to spend a lot of time kind of explaining the context first, but I'll try and be brief doing that.
That sounds good.
First of all, I'm not actually investing in longevity, but I'm more focused on people being healthy. I don't care so much how long, but how well they live. Second, so what I'm doing is a nonprofit. It's a 10-year project. It's longer than, unfortunately, life insurance. Well, maybe not life insurance, but certainly longer than your average health insurance person is going to be on any particular health insurance provider. It's longer than your average employee is going to be with the employer. So you have the challenge of how to keep people healthy for long. So what I'm really looking at is spending 10 years showing that if you invest in health, you will get a really nice return. Not health care, but actual health. The vegetables, the prenatal care, the early childhood education, good school lunches, addiction programs, and the kind of lifestyle that makes it easier to avoid all these problems. The challenge is, who is you? Is it a community? Is it an individual? How can you invest in health? And it's not simply everybody should buy a Fitbit, pay their own insurance premium, and stay healthy. That's just not going to happen. And what I like is we've heard a lot today, partly for me, about this big divide between all us nice, rich white folks here in this room and all the poor white and black folks who are angry, who are not being paid attention to. How many of you have read Hillbilly Elegies? It's kind of like the book of the year. It's about cheap white trash in Appalachia and the kind of conditions that make it the kind of conditions that make you fundamentally, predictably unlucky in everything, in health, in education, in income, and so forth. And the reality is we're all paying taxes because these people are sick, they're often in jail, they're addicted. It's very expensive, not just for them, but for us. Why don't we spend the same money and keep them healthy? That's our basic mission. And so we're working, Way to Wellville, my nonprofit, is working in 5 small communities around the U.S., trying to help them keep themselves healthy and show the kinds of returns it can generate. And then we need to figure out how we get people to pay for that. But it's just as Donald Trump is talking about bridges and airport infrastructure, to me, the most important infrastructure that we should be investing in is human hearts and minds.
Okay. Well, further, much more to go back to. So, Nick, I think you've now created a longevity ETF. Is that right? So a way to actually invest in some of these trends. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I guess I'm the lemming that you were referring to.
Nice
and I'm very happy to be one. It's fine. Just by way of background, so Janus Capital is a $200 billion asset manager based in Denver. I started a ETF company 6 years ago that we sold to them 2 years ago. And for those of you who aren't familiar, exchange-traded funds are basically probably the single fastest growing part of finance for reasons that are interesting but not particularly relevant to this conference. But what's happened is that pretty much all of the kind of unique financial innovation that's going on right now in sort of core investing is happening in ETFs because ETFs are sort of the fastest growing area. So there's nothing kind of that makes that have to be true, but it is in fact true. And one of the big kind of evolutions that's going on right now is people shifting towards this concept of thematic investing. So for Janus, when we launched, we launched the long-term care ETF, the ticker's old, and thank you. It's like my
I thought that was funny.
Job. I'm like, I'm quite proud of our tickers. Anyway, for us it was fairly simple, which is that we're not looking necessarily at the nonprofit side. We have a very simple objective, which is help people make money. And so if we say, okay, what is the long-term demographics that are driving kind of the future economy, one of the most obvious is the aging population, okay? And I think, from being here today, it seems like, we were right in our thesis, which is that the overwhelming majority of people who are trying to invest in it are looking at sort of biotech, tech, healthcare startups as the way to invest in the aging population. And our view was, that's really hard. The sort of example that we commonly will use is if you were sort of a brilliant prognosticator and had figured out that the horse and buggy was going to go away, there were probably thousands of car companies you could have invested in, none of which were Ford and most of which went bankrupt. And so while it is probably true, if I was in the government or nonprofit sector, that I should be really focused on this kind of healthcare innovation, as an investor, that's not necessarily the right place to be. And the comment was made earlier that the reality is most people are going to end up in long-term care at some point. Our view was that's kind of the safest way to invest in this demographic trend. So we have a very simple product which simply invests in long-term care companies. And it looks a lot like a utility.
And do they have do those companies have single exposure to long-term care, or are they like mixed up with other types of healthcare too?
Yeah, so I mean the basic criteria for the company to be in the ETF is there's some minimum criteria around market cap and tradability, et cetera. But a majority of their revenues has to come from long-term care.
The majority, okay.
Most of them, I would say on average, it's 90% plus. But we invest in sort of large REIT conglomerates generally, so it's companies like Welltower, Ventus, well-known names who provide long-term care, and it's a global portfolio. So, are those companies they're basically consumers of all of the things that everybody here is talking about, right? And our view is, as an investor, no matter which technology is successful, it's going to be deployed in long-term care communities.
Okay, thank you. So it's always interesting to follow the money and see where it's smart money and where it's dumb money chasing bad ideas. Let's talk about both. So Laura, if you don't mind starting, where do you feel like is an potentially underfunded area? as you look to invest in longevity, and where is their capital going where it probably shouldn't be and it's not going to pan out very well?
Oh, that's a fascinating. I don't know if I can do that question justice, actually, but I'll try a little bit, I guess. I can give one example, which is about 4 years ago, we invested in a company called Unity. At that time, it was called Nexus, now it's called Unity. And they were doing senescent cell deletion. So it's basically if you have an old mouse and it has a bunch of old cells and you get rid of all of them, it looks like a young mouse. And it's like this magical thing that happens, and people wonder whether it's possible to use that to kind of make an aging therapeutic. And that company, when we invested in it, I think I just thought the technology was like really cool, and the entrepreneur was like really smart. And I don't think there was anything about it that mirrors any of the companies that I see a lot today that have the word aging in their title and are very. It was just this really cool technology, and they just raised $100 million. Very successful fundraise. I mean, they're one of, I think, the best performing companies in the field, independent as a private biotech today. And I think one of the reasons for that is that you just saw an incredible piece of science that any scientist, like even a scientist who wasn't working in aging, would be excited about this science because it was such cool science. And I think you want to look for those companies. I think there are a lot of companies now that are like, we really wanted to cure Alzheimer's, so we had a drug for that, but we're going to call ourselves aging because that's kind of a good label to slap on this, pitch deck at the moment. And it's really obvious when you see the difference between that and like cool fundamental science that you really feel can have an impact.
But has Unity actually had an impact yet?
I mean, definitely the jury's out. And I think, it could be the case that when they go into humans, there are some major surprises that we would be able to predict right now. But I think of all the companies out there, they're some of the most different in their approach. I think a lot of companies kind of are going after very traditional small molecule pathways. There are a lot of, if you count the number of companies in Alzheimer's that are targeting A-beta and compare it to the number of companies targeting senescent cells, it's an interesting marker of kind of what happens when you have a singular focus for a field versus kind of a novel approach. That maybe has a lot more risk, but if the risk pans out, it might have a lot more reward.
So when you look at the dumb money, is it investing in kind of undifferentiated areas that are targeting aging, or like where do you feel like people are making a mistake if they want exposure to this?
People make the mistake of looking in the field of aging to find good aging companies. And I would say all the companies the majority of companies that we found that are the best companies don't call themselves aging companies. They come from diabetes, actually is the number one place, I think, to find great aging companies. And a lot of them don't even think of themselves as aging companies. They're working on what they consider diabetes assets or cancer assets or Alzheimer's assets. But in all the cases, you can find that the drug that they're working on has been shown in mice to actually extend lifespan by a significant amount. Mm-hmm. And so that's a really interesting link that this company may not have considered, and that it may be part of the way that the drug is acting. And so I think I think it's just like a hugely underappreciated fact is that most of the interesting companies that may have a huge impact on aging may have thought that they were the biggest diabetes company to go out there. And it's the biggest aging company.
So Nick and then Esther, where do you feel like where do you see mistakes in terms of where capital is going? Where do you feel like not enough is going as people look for exposure to this sector?
Well, I think the interesting point that you were making around the kind of prerequisites to having a chance to age, is pretty interesting. And so, when we launched this product, we launched a number of other products along with it, including a health and fitness product, obesity product, because the reality is all these things are intimately connected. And so, if what you care about is aging, really what you should be caring about is quality of life, right? And so, we're sitting in San Francisco, and people want to talk about tech, and I get that. But the reality is, if you go out and exercise every day and aren't obese, you're probably dramatically better off than any amount of technology is going to do for you when you're 70, right? I mean, I'm a long ways off from that, but I look at my folks, and just generally speaking, the people I know who are active into old age and are healthy, they're not concerned about how long they're going to live, and there's people in their 50s who are probably wishing they weren't going to live that much longer because it's not that pleasant for them anymore. So I think really the critical thing is the health and fitness component, and obesity is an immense problem, and that's probably the wrong terminology, but it's a very significant problem all around the globe, and it's really unbelievable, right? So to me, obesity is probably the single most relevant thing we could be looking at.
What is the ticker for the obesity ETF, out of curiosity?
It's not fat. It's
I was wondering.
It's slim.
Slim, okay. Esther, as you look at capital, where are you seeing mistakes and opportunities?
Well, to me, first of all, you're absolutely right. No matter what happens to you, if you're in good shape when it happens to you, whether it's anesthesia, I was just hearing how much more dangerous anesthesia is for people who are compromised in some way. They just did a study showing that if you have HIV, if you're HIV positive and you control that, your biggest risk is diabetes, not the AIDS. So I think the great opportunities are probably in your slim, but beyond that, talking more specifically about business models, and most of these companies are not yet public. I'm an investor in Omada, disclosure, that would be one. But there's a whole bunch of companies, they have a protocol, whether it's for diabetes or for kind of group therapy around parenting and trauma-informed care or various kinds of wellness. But you take that and you don't just put a bot at the end of a telephone. You deliver it through real coaches. And what we're trying to do in our 5 communities is work with all these protocol people and train local people to deliver that particular service, whether it's health coaching or nurse-family partnership or any of that. Combine that curriculum with local presence, and you get 2 benefits. You employ people in the community, and you deliver the health creation, and that creates a huge improvement in the overall community health. And including, you can include old people, you can include retired nurses, you can include high school students preparing food for elders. That's something called the Series Project. So that's what I would invest in. On the other side, there's way too many wearables and fitness apps and I'm wearing a whole bunch of them, but that is way overcrowded. It's the same thing. It's the 100 car companies. Yeah, there's Ford and GM, but most of them are going to be acquired not at a high multiple, but basically for their assets.
Yeah, I mean, I think you don't have to go too far back in history to where you lived and then you had sort of an unpleasant and abrupt end to your life. And a lot of what's happening is that the unpleasant sets in because people aren't healthy, but then there's not an abrupt end, and it's prolonged for a very long time. And that is entirely around people's health when they get to that age. I mean, I used to live in Oakland, and I now live in Aspen, Colorado. Okay, so when I lived in Oakland, there was constantly surrounded by people in their 40s and 50s who are, getting around in carts and, extremely unhealthy and really having a hard time aging. I'm in Aspen. I'm an outdoors guy. Colorado's one of the healthiest states in the country. And I'll be climbing up Aspen Mountain, which is pretty challenging to do. And there's 60-year-old women passing me like constantly. And it's, you realize, okay, you're not really all that great. And they're not, they're not worried about aging. That's a totally different conversation. They're having a fantastic time and they're very, very healthy. And everybody has medical issues, but health before aging is the most critical part of aging.
So I asked my previous panelists which of the existing tech giants they would bet on to disrupt healthcare or life extension. If you look broadly at this area, they actually all deflected and said it's going to be an outsider. What are your views? Do you feel like any of the companies that are investing in this area, a la Google, stand a real chance of creating a very large business in the space? And Esther, go ahead.
This is partly aspirational, but I loved what Lisa said about Walmart, except I see Walmart also as an employer. If they could, they keep giving mixed signals, but it really is the employers who are embedded in a community that have the opportunity to do this. When we were selecting out of 42 applications, the communities for Wellville, there was one we turned down because it was too good. And that was Columbus, Indiana, which is the company town of Cummins Engine. Employers, if they want to do it and if they have a long-term view, are probably the very best equipped institutions until we get to the nirvana of, somehow figuring out how to do long-term investment.
So companies that are investing through their health programs rather than companies that are investing to create a disruptive business around it.
Google's doing that with its employees too, but they're already healthy enough.
Yeah. They're passing you on the mountain.
Those ladies, they were 70.
Yeah, many of them probably are. I mean, my neighbor who lives across the street is in his 70s and just broke his leg heli skiing in British Columbia. So anyway, my answer to that question is I have no idea. I don't think very many people in this room have that great of an idea. And I think that even if you are right, that doesn't mean you can make money investing in that company. And so, I'm not a scientist. I'm not an expert on aging. What we do is help people with investing. And the conclusion that we've come to is that there are probably in the private equity world ways to make money here, but there's a lot of ways to lose money. And what we know is that if all these companies are very successful, the age at which people have to go into long-term care will be delayed, but they're still going to need long-term care eventually. And so our kind of from a pure raw math investing standpoint, our point of view is the only reliable thing is that eventually people are going to need long-term care. What that's going to look like, how much it's going to cost, what kind of technology they're going to have, what kind of healthcare they're going to receive, I have no idea. But from an investment perspective, I don't really care either. Somebody's going to provide that. The people who are going to provide it are going to be long-term care companies, and there's a reason they kind of sit there as these sort of very stable companies that are putting out 4.5% yields. They look like good investments to me.
Yeah.
So that, to me, that's the easy cop-out answer.
And there's always these oblique ways of getting it to the investment. I remember a few years ago writing about Gymboree, the children's clothing company, and Bain Capital did a buyout of it, and it was ultimately a bet on grandparents spending a lot on their grandchildren. But of course, a lot can also go wrong with birth rates, et cetera. So you can get hurt even if your thesis is right structurally.
Yeah, we have, again, the ETF world's kind of a different world, which I won't get into too much, but we get pitched all the time on ideas for like ETFs. And it gets the connection between the concept, which is a great one, aging, and the investment gets extremely dislocated. There's this guy who's been trying to pitch us for a number of years on launching a marijuana ETF, which I think is fantastic. But then his idea is that you're going to own, things like Lowe's and Home Depot. Which makes no sense to me at all. And he's like, well, people have to build greenhouses. You get to these sort of in connection between, it's true, this happens all the time. We get pitched on this stuff all the time. And so the connection that exists between the thesis and the investment can get really challenging. And so there has to be a clear connection. If you're doing private equity, you're in a slightly different world. But in public company space, it's challenging. And so that's, we're trying to keep it as simple as possible.
Laura, do you have a strong view on, if you had to pick one of the existing players that's in the Valley?
No, I don't.
Okay. Let's talk about regulatory, because obviously that's like a regulatory issues. It's a huge risk for startups. Laura, how do you handicap that when you're looking at startups in the space?
Yes, I think you'll see two experts in that space speaking later today, so I don't know I can say anything that they wouldn't have a lot more context on. I think for us, we kind of view it as just a very inherently inefficient thing that we have to address. And we actually, for that reason, don't favor companies that have a strategy, at least right now we don't favor them, based on approval for aging at all. I don't think that's something, like we want to support efforts to make aging something that is approvable, but we don't really view that as an actual disease from a regulatory perspective that a startup can get approval for today, even though we think scientifically there are a lot of reasons to think that it should be. So all of our companies go through very standard regulatory pathways, and they focus on very well-known, very well-benchmarked diseases that we believe are caused by aging. And I think part of our thesis is that if you have a company that gets to market with a diabetes drug, but the asset that it's used to get there is an aging asset, it should also have efficacy in other age-related diseases. And so the market that you're looking at is actually maybe tenfold higher than just kind of the first market that you happen to get approval for. But that doesn't impact the regulatory path used to get there, if that makes sense.
Yeah. We've been talking a bit before about empathy bots, robots, social, basically companionship. How much strongly do you believe that this is going to be a trend? Either redesigning interfaces for older people, creating bots or robots that are social. Is that kind of a real side issue from your perspective, or a monetizable business bet?
Can I jump in here and just go back to regulatory?
Yeah.
not necessarily as an investment, but I think one of the most important things the country could do, and some municipalities are already doing it, is to price the costs of sugar back into what people pay for sugar instead of subsidizing it. So just as we tax cigarettes, we should be taxing sugar, especially added sugar.
So you're saying end subsidies or tax it?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you can't, end the subsidy and then start taxing it, and then apply that money to investing in some form in diabetes prevention or subsidizing vegetables or something like that. Nutrition is just...
You're going to have to wait at least 4 years for that.
I was going to say, under a Trump presidency.
But I think Berkeley's already done it, and perhaps your old place, Oakland, but community by community, and again, our goal is to do that in a few of our communities and just show the impact. Ironically, one of the communities we previously worked with, Niagara Falls, has a smoking rate of 37%. And it's because they get tax-free cigarettes from the local Native American casino. So incentive payments work.
Absolutely.
It is absolutely shocking to me how obvious that statement is and how many people will argue with you about it. And the Economist actually had a similar event to this in Dubai that I was at a month ago, which was around obesity. And they had a panel that was explicitly around talking about taxing sugary drinks. Okay, and up there on this panel is the woman from Mars, Dubai. Okay, you know what her point of view was. But also up there were people running the health authority in Dubai. Okay, Dubai has like a 70% obesity rate. It's absolutely shocking, and people are, drinking soda nonstop. And she sat up there and said over and over again that, as far as she could tell, there was no evidence that taxing sugary drinks would change people's behavior. And the woman from Mars said, well, they're just going to buy, 6 small drinks instead. I mean, it just went on and on and on, and nobody was interested in challenging them. There was some doctors who did. And the humorous part of this was, at the end of all that, there was a guy there as well who was from the EU Commission on Obesity, who said, it's very nice that you're from Mars, and we've dealt with you in Europe, and you're lying, and we know for a fact that these things make a difference, but it is almost unfathomable to imagine that rolling out in any meaningful way in the near term, because it's just so politicized.
Yeah, you're right, as a country, but in specific locations, yes.
Absolutely. All right, I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience, and I have a couple others, but let's take, if we have any through the app, or please raise your hands high so I can see them. We have one here in the center, and then I'll come to you after.
Laura, there was a little bit of a debate earlier about whether or not we can use model organisms to test drugs that we're going to administer to humans. Do you have a stance on that?
Yeah, I think there are hierarchies of things that you can believe about model organisms. And maybe the most important property that you can find from them is transcendence from species barriers. So if you see a gene that when you knock it out in worms makes them like 10 times longer than normal, that's great, right? But if it also makes flies live longer, if it makes mice live like 60% longer than normal, and if you can find human genetics to correlate that in humans, like long-lived centenarians have the same gene affected in them, I think that kind of cross-species transcendence of a scientific property is a very powerful one to look at. I would completely agree that I think a lot of people have quibbles with using mice that you inject with A-beta to prove the theory that getting rid of A-beta causes Alzheimer's. Like that is kind of ridiculous. But I think that if you can see some property that's replicated across different types of species and is proven out also by human genetics or human population demographics, then that is a very powerful way to use model organisms. That makes sense to me.
Great. We had another question.
For Laura mostly. It seems almost everyone here is just not even thinking about increasing maximum lifespan. They're talking about increasing average lifespan. The things that you're looking into, do you think those have the potential to increase maximum lifespan, or is that not even a possibility?
Yes, definitely. I think they definitely do.
Could you elaborate?
Well, I think, so it might be a bit different for most of the folks here. That like that for me, that's the whole point. Like that's what I'm interested in. I think for the most part, and I think if you go to the model organisms that we're looking at, and all the mouse models that we're interested in, you see maximum lifespan increase as well as mean and median lifespan. And so that's just, and it could be the case that in mice, for some reason, the mean lifespan property translates over to humans, but the maximum lifespan property doesn't. But I mean, I think it's something that we don't know, but that's what we're interested in, definitely, and I think that's what we were hopeful for.
Okay, other questions? Yes, just right over here, the first table.
Hi, I'm Nancy Robert with the American Nurses Association, and this is for Esther. Just what you're trying to do, there's a huge cultural transformation that must take place. Given how far you've come with your projects, do you have any advice about lessons learned about how difficult it is for the cultural transformation?
Okay, yeah, thanks. First of all, it's a 10-year project. We're 2 years in, and we are very explicitly not, like a marketing, promote health, send out pamphlets in the community kind of thing. There are two things we've done very, very purposely. One is these are small places, partly because my resources are limited. And secondly, because what we want is density. It's despite what I said about employers, it's not simply you reach 10,000 people in a suburb of 200,000 people. We're trying to change the environment for everybody in the community. You go out and you hit sort of the older people, and they're depressed, they're addicted, they're obese, they're diabetic or pre-diabetic, and let's face it, that's really, really hard to fix. But then you talk to them about their kids. They all want a better life for their kids. And that's kind of how you get in. So the focus is not on extending the lives of the seniors, though grandparents can be a really important thing in the lives of their grandkids, especially if the parents aren't working out too well. But we're focused more on critical density than critical mass, reaching the kids, starting out with prenatal care and so forth. That's why it takes so long. And most of the really good effects you won't see for a long, long time. But the second piece of culture we have to change, in the business we talk a lot about patient engagement. There's also institutional engagement, because somewhere you need some local entity, whether it's the local YMCA or the local health system or the local effective charity, that needs to move from we hand out pamphlets to we're going to launch a program. We know this works, but now we're going to do it at scale. And somebody needs to be in charge. Somebody needs to be responsible for making it work. Someone needs to set deadlines and hire people and have a budget and make commitments. And that's not usually the culture. So that's the biggest change. And all these things need to happen together.
And Esther, I have a follow-on question, which is a personal one. So you've recently had an experience with the healthcare system.
Oh, yeah.
I'm curious, emerging from that, whether your view on anything has been changed.
Okay, so kind of like Craig Venter, I recently had cancer. And I did have it. It's gone. It was treated quickly. I was, unlike the predictably unlucky people, I was unpredictably lucky. I trained as a cosmonaut, as some of you may know. They gave me a lot of, kind of similar to what health longevity does, and discovered that I had Barrett's esophagus, which is a precursor to cancer of the esophagus. So they discovered my cancer of the esophagus in stage 0. I had it removed. Unlike Craig Venter, I didn't get it removed 2 weeks after it was discovered. I spent about 3 months shuttling from one place to another, doing the hand carrying of the medical records from one institution to another. The insurance had an 800 number that had a voice system. So did the hospital, so I couldn't get the insurance to talk to the hospital.
No bots that they could kind of hook up with. No.
Anyway, so everything you've ever heard about how horrible it is, it's true. They don't tell you after the procedure. The advice I got was resume your normal diet. Then I Googled it and discovered you're supposed to have a liquid diet for a day or two.
So broken, did you leave thinking that there were any obvious fixes besides hiring people to pick up the phone?
It's kind of like the communities I work in. It's culture change. It's very difficult. The ACA is awesome. It's not just who's paying that everybody talks about. It's what they are paying for. The shift to paying for outcomes, the shift to paying for prevention of diabetes in 2018 in Medicare. Behavior change is so slow, and financial incentives applied to an institution don't really affect the daily work of the doctors and the nurses in the institution. So it just made it all more visible and tangible, but it was nothing. It was something, fortunately, I had not experienced, but it's certainly totally what everybody tells you about. The system is broken, and it desperately needs fixing, but it's not going to be easy. And simple financial incentives are not the entire answer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So right here in the center.
Thank you. Hi, Laura. I had a question for you. I think you made a really interesting point about you don't necessarily have to look in the aging space to identify an aging company. And you were talking about navigating the existing regulatory system in terms of selecting a disease indication to pursue that was actually targeting a fundamental degeneration process. If you were going to try to form regulation around targeting diseases, we had some preliminary discussion earlier, but what biomarkers would you be looking at from a clinical perspective?
So I think Esther and Nick might actually have a better answer to this than I would. I would say it's very unknown, and I think the major studies to determine that haven't yet been. I think a lot of people would like there to be one, and one thing that I'm hopeful about would be something that would be epigenetic related, would be really awesome, but I think it's still very open-ended as a question, but it's a really good question.